Think back to the early 1930s, to a place where the sky didn't storm, the ground did. Across the heart of the United States, fields that had fed families for generations began to lift into the air, not slowly, not gently, but all at once. The soil itself turning against the people who depended on it. By midday, towns vanished, not destroyed, simply erased. The sun still shone, but it could no longer be seen. Dust filled the sky so completely that noon looked like night. People tied cloth around their faces. Windows were sealed with newspapers. Children learned to breathe through fabric before they learned to read. They called them black blizzards, storms of dirt so thick they swallowed roads, homes, entire communities. Storms that didn't pass in hours, but returned again and again until the land itself felt hostile. This wasn't just bad weather. This was the American heartland becoming unlivable. Farms failed, animals panicked, crops died where they stood, and slowly, quietly, families began to leave, packing their lives into cars and driving west, chased by a land that no longer held them. The Dust Bowl wasn't the deadliest disaster America ever faced, but it may have been the one that changed it the most. And for those who lived through it, the memory never settled, much like the dust itself. It began quietly enough, with dry winds, empty skies, and a belief that the land would always provide. Subscribe and help us to reach 500 until Christmas. I really appreciate it. Thanks. April 14th, 1935. The morning broke soft and clear over the Oklahoma Panhandle. After weeks of relentless wind and choking dust, the sun rose in a sky so blue it seemed to mock the misery of the months before. Farmers stepped out onto their porches and inhaled deeply, fresh air. Finally, women hung laundry on clotheslines for the first time in weeks, watching white sheets flutter in the gentle breeze. Children burst outdoors, laughing, running through fields that hadn't seen play in what felt like forever. Some families packed picnic baskets. Others drove to church in freshly washed suits, grateful for a day that felt almost normal. In liberal Kansas, a young mother pushed her baby in a carriage, enjoying the warmth of spring. No one could see what was coming. In those days, there were no satellites, no radar, no weather apps on telephones, no television meteorologists pointing at maps. If a storm was coming, you found out when it arrived. And by then, sometimes, it was too late. Around noon, people in the northern counties noticed something strange. Birds began flying south in great, frantic waves. Sparrows, crows, blackbirds, all moving together fast and low. Rabbits ran across open fields in the same direction. Cattle grew restless. Dogs whimpered and pawed at doors. Then someone looked north and stopped breathing. On the horizon, where sky should have met land, there was only darkness. A wall of black, boiling cloud, stretching from the ground to the heavens, rolling forward like something alive. Some said it looked like a tidal wave made of soil. Others said it looked like the end of the world. One woman in Texas, Pearl Sowers, watched it approach with her family. "We stood and watched it a while," she later recalled. "The closer it got, the blacker and bigger it got, so we all ran to the cellar." The storm hit at 4:47 p.m. Within minutes, visibility dropped to zero, not reduced. Zero. People could not see their own hands in front of their faces. In Boise City, a man named Tommy Peckham got lost walking home from his neighbor's house. He stumbled through the blackness, disoriented, until he found a door and knocked on it. "This is Tommy Peckham," he said, "and I'm lost. May I come in?" The voice that answered was his wife's. He had been knocking on his own front door. He was home, and he didn't even know it. The temperature dropped more than 30 degrees in minutes. The wind screamed at 50, 60 miles per hour. And the dust got into everything, through sealed windows, under doors, into lungs, into eyes, into ears. People wrapped wet towels around their faces. Mothers held damp cloths over the noses of crying babies. Families huddled in closets, praying. Some people caught outside simply dropped to their knees and crawled. One man crawled half a mile in a ditch to get home. He survived, but the dust he inhaled gave him pneumonia. Many others weren't so lucky. The storm raged for hours. When it finally passed, people emerged into a changed world. Dust drifted against houses like snow. Cars were buried to their windows. Livestock lay dead in the fields, their stomachs filled with dirt. The sun, when it finally reappeared, had a strange violet tint, bruised, as if the sky itself had been beaten. A reporter caught in the storm, Robert Geiger, would write a story that appeared in newspapers the next day. In it, he coined a phrase that would define an era. He called the region the Dust Bowl, and April 14th, 1935 would forever be known as Black Sunday. But Black Sunday wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even close. To understand how America's heartland became a wasteland, we have to go back to a time when the plains seemed endless, the soil seemed rich, and the rain seemed like it would never stop falling. Before there were farms, there was grass, miles and miles of it. Buffalo grass, blue grama, and side oats stretching to the horizon in every direction. For thousands of years, the Great Plains had been a sea of green and gold, home to vast herds of bison and the Native American tribes who hunted them. The grass was everything. Its roots reached deep into the earth, sometimes 10 feet or more, creating a dense, tangled web that held the soil in place. It captured rainfall and stored moisture. It protected the land from the relentless wind that swept across the open prairie. Early explorers who crossed the region called it the Great American Desert. They saw no trees, little water, and an environment that seemed hostile to settlement. In 1820, an army expedition reported that the land was almost wholly unfit for cultivation. For decades, Americans agreed. The plains were meant to be passed through, not lived on. Then came the railroads, and everything changed. After the Civil War, steel tracks began stretching westward across the prairie. Railroad companies, eager to profit from the empty land they'd been granted, launched massive campaigns to attract settlers. They printed brochures in a dozen languages, distributed them across America and Europe, and made promises that today seem almost criminal. "Rain follows the plough," the pamphlets proclaimed. The theory, popular at the time, held that cultivating land would somehow change the climate itself. "Plant crops," the experts said, "and the rain will come." It was pseudoscience. But people believed it. Families arrived by the thousands, Germans and Swedes and Czechs and Irish, veterans of the Civil War looking for a new start, sons of farmers from crowded eastern states, all drawn by the Homestead Act of 1862, which promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. They built houses from sod because there was no timber. They dug wells that sometimes came up dry. They learned to live without neighbors for miles in any direction, and they began to plow. At first, the grass fought back. The thick root systems were nearly impossible to cut with traditional plows. Settlers called the prairie the sod, and the dense matted earth hardpan. Tearing it up was backbreaking work, but new technology was coming. Steel plows, steam tractors, and eventually gasoline-powered machines that could do the work of 100 men. The grass didn't stand a chance. Then came World War I, and wheat became gold. Europe's farms were battlefields. Their farmers were soldiers. And America was asked to feed the world. "Wheat will win the war," the government declared. "Plant more wheat." Prices soared to $2 a bushel, more money than many farmers had ever imagined. So they planted, and planted, and planted. Land that had been prairie for 10,000 years was turned over in a single season. Between 1900 and 1920, the amount of farmland on the plains doubled. By 1930, it had tripled again. 33 million acres of native grass were gone, replaced by endless rows of winter wheat. Nobody thought about what would happen if the rain stopped. Nobody thought about what would happen if the wind got hold of that bare, exposed soil. Nobody thought about it at all, because in the 1920s the rains kept falling, the wheat kept growing, and the money kept flowing. The hardest times seemed behind them. The future looked bright, but nature has a memory, and the plains were about to remind everyone of something they had forgotten, that this land had always been dry, that droughts had always come, and that without the grass to hold it, the soil had nothing but air to turn to. The first warning came in 1930, but few people paid attention. The rains that summer were lighter than usual. Streams ran lower. Wells had to be pumped longer, but the wheat still grew and farmers still made money, so most shrugged it off. A dry year was nothing new. It had happened before. It would pass. It didn't pass. In 1931, the drought tightened its grip. The southern plains, which normally received about 20 inches of rain per year, got barely 15. In some places, less than 10. The wheat that farmers planted in the fall never sprouted. Fields that should have been green with winter crops remained brown and bare. By 1932, people started to worry. Then in January, the dust began to blow. The first storms were small, local, easy to dismiss as just another rough day on the prairie, but they kept coming. 14 dust storms swept across the region that year. The next year there were 38. The dust wasn't like sand. It was finer, lighter, almost powdery. One survivor described it as feeling like talcum powder. It could slip through cracks too small for air to pass. It found its way into homes, into clothes, into food, into the deepest recesses of the human body. Women developed a grim routine. Every morning they would shovel dust out of their homes. They sealed windows with paste made from flour and water. They stuffed wet newspapers into the cracks around doors. They hung wet sheets over windows to catch the dirt. It was never enough. The dust would pile up on tables and chairs, on beds and cribs, on plates of food set down for just a moment. Women swept 5, 6, 7 times a day. They scrubbed and wiped and cleaned until their hands were raw. And still the dust came. One Kansas woman, Caroline Henderson, wrote letters to a friend back east, describing the ordeal. "There are days," she said, "when I am resolved that I will simply not write another word. But the dirt keeps coming, and I suppose I must keep trying." The storms grew worse and stranger. The dust carried so much static electricity that blue flames would leap along barbed wire fences, crackling and sparking in the darkness. Car engines would die as the static shorted out their ignition systems. People began dragging chains behind their vehicles to ground the electricity. And the shocks were everywhere. Neighbors who shook hands could knock each other to the ground. Children running to hug their mothers would generate sparks powerful enough to stun them both. People learned to touch metal objects carefully, approaching them slowly, letting the charge dissipate before making full contact. In Paris, Texas, a grandmother told her grandchildren stories about those years. One of her favorites was about the tumbleweeds. The static electricity from the blowing dust would set them on fire, she said. You'd see balls of fire rolling across the fields, and then the tumbleweeds would catch on the fence lines and set the whole fence ablaze. She lived to be 93, that grandmother, and she never forgot. But the electricity was only a symptom. The real killer was the dust itself. They called it dust pneumonia, or sometimes the brown plague. The dust that filled the air wasn't just dirt. It was ancient prairie soil, ground fine by centuries of wind and weather. And it contained silica, the same mineral that gives miners black lung. When inhaled, those tiny particles lodged deep in the lungs, inflaming the tissue, filling the air sacs with grit that the body couldn't clear. The coughing would start first, then fever, then trouble breathing. Doctors in the region had never seen anything like it. There were no antibiotics in wide use yet, no modern treatments. All they could do was try to ease the symptoms while the body fought a battle it often couldn't win. The elderly died, the sick died, and worst of all, the children died. In Kansas alone, dozens of deaths were recorded from dust pneumonia and suffocation in the years following Black Sunday. The true toll was likely much higher, as many deaths in remote areas went unreported. The Red Cross set up emergency stations across the affected region. Volunteers made and distributed thousands of face masks, the same design that had been used to protect soldiers from poison gas in the trenches of France just 15 years earlier. Now they were being used to protect American children from American soil. In one small Oklahoma town, Floyd Cohen was a boy when his little sister got sick. She developed the telltale cough, the fever, the labored breathing. The doctor came, but there was nothing he could do. She died in one room of their two-room house, while Floyd lay sick with the same illness in the other. He survived. She didn't. The doctor carried her small body out on a table leaf so the family could see her one last time. Decades later, as an old man, Floyd would recall that moment with tears in his eyes. "That was the hardest thing on me," he said, "and still is. She was such a perfect little thing." Stories like Floyd's were repeated across the Dust Bowl, in thousands of homes, in hundreds of small towns. Parents who couldn't protect their children from the very air they breathed. Families who watched loved ones slip away from an illness that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And it wasn't just the pneumonia. The dust affected everything. People blew their noses and mud came out. They brushed their teeth and tasted grit. They cleaned dust from their eyelids, their ears, the corners of their mouths. Even when storms weren't blowing, the haze was constant, filtering the sunlight, turning the world a sickly brown. Children who grew up during those years would later describe knowing nothing but a brown world. They had never seen clear blue skies. They didn't know what it was like to walk outside without tasting dirt. For them, the dust was simply reality. In schools across the region, teachers developed emergency protocols. When dust storms rolled in, children were told to take shelter under stairwells in case the building collapsed from the weight of the accumulated dust. Many schools closed entirely when conditions were severe. Teachers who tried to commute to rural schoolhouses would sometimes have to navigate by following telephone poles, unable to see the road beneath them. One teacher from Texas remembered arriving at school to find her students frozen after riding horseback through the bitter cold and dust. Another recalled a ceiling collapsing in the middle of the night, the accumulated weight of the dust finally too much for the roof to bear. Families did what they could to adapt. Mothers placed wet cloths over the faces of newborns to help them breathe. Fathers stuffed every crack in their homes with newspapers and rags. At night, people slept with wet towels over their faces, waking to find the fabric caked with mud. One Kansas grandmother remembered having to stuff newspapers into the cracks of the floor and around the doors just to keep the dust from burying them while they slept. She had to crawl home from the store on her hands and knees during one storm because visibility was completely gone. Her cattle died by the dozens. When farmers butchered the surviving animals, they found stomachs half filled with dirt. And then there were the grasshoppers. As if the dust wasn't enough, plagues of insects descended on the parched fields, eating whatever the drought had spared. Millions of them, darkening the sky, covering fences and buildings and anything that stood still. They ate crops. They ate fence posts. They ate the handles of farm tools left outside. One farmer swore they ate the sweat-stained leather of his work gloves. The jackrabbits came too, hundreds of thousands of them, driven from their normal range by the changing conditions, overrunning farms and devouring anything green. Desperate farmers organized community rabbit drives, herding the animals into pens and killing them with clubs. A grim, necessary task that haunted many who participated for the rest of their lives. The land that had promised so much was now trying to kill everything on it. And for many families, there came a moment, a breaking point, when staying meant risking everything, and leaving felt like the only chance at survival. By 1935, the roads leading west had become rivers of desperation. Old cars and trucks, loaded far beyond capacity, crept along the highways. Mattresses strapped to roofs, pots and pans dangling from tailgates, children wedged between bundles of clothing. Everything a family owned, reduced to what could be tied onto a vehicle that might not make it to the next town. US Highway 66 became known as the Mother Road. It stretched from Chicago to Los Angeles, cutting right through the heart of the Dust Bowl, and for hundreds of thousands of migrants, it represented the only path to salvation. They came from Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, from Colorado and New Mexico and Nebraska. They came because their crops had failed and their cattle had died, because the bank had taken their farms, because they couldn't watch their children go hungry for another day. California was the destination for most. The word had spread, whispered in general stores, passed along in letters from relatives, printed on handbills distributed by labor contractors looking for cheap workers. California had fertile valleys. California had jobs picking fruit. California had rain. One survivor remembered the mood of those years. Most of the people in the Dust Bowl talked about California. They'd seen all the pretty pictures about California, and they'd heard all the pretty songs. And they said, well, if this dust keeps on blowing the way it is, we're gonna have to go somewhere. The journey was brutal. The trip from Oklahoma to California was nearly 1,500 miles, a journey that could take 3 days in a modern car, but often took 2 or 3 weeks in the battered vehicles of the Depression era. Breakdowns were constant. Money was scarce. Gas stations and diners along the route charged whatever they wanted, knowing that desperate travelers had no choice but to pay. Some families ran out of money halfway through. Some ran out of food. Some ran out of hope. Vehicles that couldn't be repaired were simply abandoned by the roadside, stripped of useful parts, and left to rust in the desert sun. The Haggard family left Oklahoma on a Monday morning in July 1935, around 11 o'clock. They couldn't hold out any longer against the dust, the repeated crop failures, and finally, a fire that had taken what little they had left. The mother, Flossie, had come to Oklahoma Territory as a 4-year-old child. Now she was leaving everything she had ever known. Her son, Merle, would grow up to become one of America's greatest country music singers. The songs he wrote about working people and hard times came from somewhere real. They came from the red dirt roads of his childhood. They came from the memories his mother carried with her all the way to California. And for those who made it, California was not the paradise they had been promised. The migrants were called Okies, regardless of where they actually came from. The term was not a compliment. It was spat like a curse. Signs appeared in store windows. No Okies allowed. Los Angeles police briefly set up roadblocks at the Arizona border, turning back anyone who looked too poor, too dusty, too desperate. Those who made it through found work in the fields, picking cotton, harvesting fruit, digging vegetables. The pay was miserable, sometimes 35 cents for a morning's labor, often less. They lived in camps along irrigation ditches, in tents and shacks made from whatever materials they could scavenge. They competed for work with Mexican laborers who had been doing these jobs for years. They endured the contempt of Californians who saw them as threats to their jobs, their wages, their way of life. Children who came from the Dust Bowl attended California schools, where they stood out painfully. Barefoot and dressed in rags, they were teased for their accents, mocked for their poverty, called maggots by their classmates. Teachers tried to change the way they spoke, the way they dressed, even what they ate for lunch. Many of these children learned to be ashamed of who they were and where they came from. "No one likes me," said one child living in a federal camp in 1938. "I'm an Okie." Another child put it even more simply, "We ain't people, we are sharecroppers." By 1940, more than 2.5 million people had fled the Dust Bowl states. It was the largest migration in American history, larger than the gold rush, larger than any movement of people the nation had ever seen. And yet, despite everything, most families stayed. They stayed because the land was all they knew. They stayed because leaving felt like giving up. They stayed because somewhere deep inside, they believed the rain would come back. They stayed because this was home. And in Washington, a president was watching, a government was learning, and a plan was taking shape that would change American farming forever. 3 out of every 4 families in the Dust Bowl never left. Think about that for a moment. While the newspapers wrote about the Great Migration, while photographers captured images of overloaded cars heading west, while the world watched hundreds of thousands flee, millions more stayed exactly where they were. They stayed in houses half buried by dirt. They stayed on farms that hadn't produced a crop in years. They stayed in towns where storefronts stood empty and churches prayed for rain that never came. Why? Some had nowhere else to go. The Great Depression had swallowed the entire country. There were no jobs waiting in the cities, no relatives with spare rooms, no savings to start over somewhere new. For many families, the choice wasn't between the Dust Bowl and California. It was between the Dust Bowl and nothing at all. But for others, staying was a choice. A stubborn, defiant, perhaps foolish choice, but a choice nonetheless. These were people whose grandparents had crossed oceans and continents to claim this land. People who had buried children in the prairie soil. People who had built their homes with their own hands, board by board, nail by nail. The land wasn't just property to them. It was identity. It was legacy. It was everything they were. One Oklahoma farmer, asked why he didn't leave, gave an answer that echoed across the region. "This is my home. My father is buried here. My children were born here. If the land wants to kill me, it can kill me here." So they adapted. They improvised. They survived. When there was nothing left to feed the cattle, farmers harvested tumbleweeds. Yes, tumbleweeds, and sprinkled them with molasses to make them edible. When crops wouldn't grow, families foraged for dandelions and lamb's quarters, wild plants that could be boiled into something resembling nutrition. When money disappeared entirely, communities turned to barter, trading eggs for flour, labor for milk, anything for anything. Women became alchemists of poverty, creating meals from almost nothing. Soup made from dried beans stretched for days. Cornmeal mush served as breakfast, lunch and dinner. Popcorn, the cheapest food available, was eaten with milk like cereal. One recipe from the era called for mixing flour, water and whatever vegetables could be found into something called depression cake. No eggs, no butter, no milk, because no one had any. The children of the Dust Bowl learned lessons that would stay with them forever. They learned to never waste food, not a single bite, not ever. Decades later, as grandparents themselves, survivors would still clean their plates completely, still save leftovers that others might throw away, still feel a pang of guilt at the sight of uneaten bread. They learned to make do, to fix instead of replace, to see value in things others considered worthless. Shoes were resoled with rubber cut from old tires. Clothes were sewn from flour sacks, the brand names of the flour still visible on the fabric. Nothing was thrown away. Nothing. They learned that family was everything. In those dark rooms, huddled together while the wind howled outside, bonds were formed that nothing could break. Brothers and sisters who shared beds and blankets and fears. Parents who sacrificed their own meals so their children could eat. Grandparents who told stories of better times, keeping hope alive with nothing but words. And they learned about resilience, about getting up each morning, even when there was no reason to. about planting seeds in soil that hadn't grown anything in years, just in case this was the year the rain came back, about refusing to quit even when quitting made all the sense in the world. In the town of Dalhart, Texas, hit harder than almost anywhere else, a group of farmers formed what they called the Last Man Club. The rules were simple. Members pledged to stay no matter what, to be the last ones standing when the dust finally settled. They met regularly, sharing meals and stories and a grim kind of humor that only people facing disaster together can understand. The club's motto became famous across the region: "We're staying, to hell with the dust." And while these families held on by their fingernails, help was finally coming, from an unexpected place. From a man in a wheelchair 1,000 miles away who understood something important, that when the land fails the people need their government to stand with them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been president for just over 2 years when Black Sunday struck. He was already fighting the Great Depression with everything he had. Banks had collapsed. Factories had closed. A quarter of all American workers had no jobs. The nation was on its knees, and Roosevelt had promised to lift it back up. But the Dust Bowl was different. This wasn't just an economic crisis. This was the land itself turning against the people who worked it. This was nature and human folly combining into something that seemed almost biblical in its devastation. Roosevelt understood farming. He had spent years developing his estate in Hyde Park, New York, planting trees, managing forests, learning the relationship between land and water and growth. He knew that what was happening in the plains wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of decades of abuse, of stripping away the grass, of plowing too deep, of taking from the soil without ever giving back. And he knew that fixing it would require more than charity. It would require changing the way Americans thought about their relationship with the earth. On April 27, 1935, just 2 weeks after Black Sunday, Congress passed the Soil Conservation Act. It declared soil erosion a national menace and created a new agency, the Soil Conservation Service, dedicated to healing the wounded land. The man Roosevelt chose to lead this effort was a soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett. Big Hugh, they called him. A man who had spent his entire career warning about erosion, writing reports that nobody read, giving speeches that nobody attended. Now, suddenly, everyone was listening. Bennett had a gift for drama. On the day he was scheduled to testify before Congress about the need for soil conservation, he learned that a massive dust storm was heading toward Washington. He stretched out his testimony, talking and talking, stalling for time. When the storm finally arrived, darkening the windows of the Capitol building, Bennett pointed at the gloom and said, "This, gentlemen, is what I have been talking about." Congress gave him everything he asked for. The programs that followed transformed the Great Plains. Government agents fanned out across the Dust Bowl, teaching farmers new techniques that many had never heard of. Contour plowing, which followed the natural curves of the land instead of cutting straight furrows. Strip cropping, which alternated rows of different plants to hold the soil. Terracing, which created natural barriers against erosion. Cover crops, which kept the ground protected even when main crops weren't growing. Farmers who agreed to use these methods were paid $1 an acre, desperately needed money that kept many families from losing their land entirely. But Roosevelt's most ambitious project was something that sounded almost impossible: a wall of trees stretching from Canada to Texas. The Great Plains Shelter Belt, they called it. The idea was to plant millions of trees in rows across the prairie, creating windbreaks that would slow the howling gusts and hold the soil in place. Critics said it couldn't be done. Trees wouldn't grow in that dry, harsh climate. The whole thing was a waste of money. Roosevelt did it anyway. He called the workers his Tree Army. Young men from the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the New Deal's most successful programs. They came from cities and farms, from every corner of the country, earning $30 a month plus room and board to do work that their grandchildren would still benefit from. Between 1935 and 1942, they planted more than 220 million trees. Red cedar and green ash, cottonwood and willow, species carefully chosen to survive the brutal plains climate. The trees stretched in rows for over 1,000 miles, creating a living barrier against the wind. Many of those trees still stand today. Drive through parts of Kansas or Nebraska or Oklahoma and you'll see them. Rows of tall trees standing like soldiers at the edges of fields, doing the job they were planted to do almost 90 years ago. The government also bought land. Millions of acres of the most damaged farmland were purchased from struggling families and taken out of production entirely. The soil needed rest. It needed time to heal. It needed grass to grow back. Some farmers resented the government's interference. They had cleared this land with their own sweat, and now Washington was telling them they'd done it wrong. Pride is a powerful thing, especially among people who have built their lives on self-reliance. But many more were grateful. The programs meant survival. They meant keeping the farm in the family. They meant hope. And then, after nearly a decade of waiting, after years of dust and death and despair, the sky finally answered. The fall of 1939. People had stopped expecting it. They had planted crops and watched them die so many times that planting had become almost an act of faith rather than farming. They went through the motions because that's what farmers do, but deep down, many had given up believing the rain would ever come back. It came back. The first drops fell in September, light at first, barely enough to notice, but then more and more. Drops became showers. Showers became storms. Real storms, the kind that had been missing for so long. Storms with thunder and lightning, storms that filled dry creek beds and turned dust to mud. People ran outside and stood in it. They lifted their faces to the sky and let the water wash over them. Children who had never seen real rain, who had grown up in a brown world of dust and haze, danced in puddles and laughed with a joy their parents had almost forgotten existed. Farmers fell to their knees in their fields and wept. The drought was over. After 8 years, after hundreds of dust storms, after countless deaths and broken dreams and abandoned farms, it was finally over. The land began to heal almost immediately. Grass sprouted where nothing had grown in years. Wildflowers bloomed. Birds returned. The air, for so long thick with dust, turned clear and clean. By 1941, the Dust Bowl was officially over. The combination of returning rainfall and the conservation techniques that had been implemented reduced blowing soil by 65%. The federal programs had worked. The land had been saved, but the scars remained. In some areas, more than 75% of the topsoil had blown away. Soil that had taken nature 1,000 years to build was gone in less than a decade. It would take generations for some fields to fully recover, and the human scars were even deeper. The people who had lived through those years were changed forever. They carried the dust in their lungs long after the storms stopped. Many suffered respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but just as real. Years of trauma that manifested in anxiety, depression, and a deep, persistent fear that the good times could vanish again at any moment. The families who had fled to California mostly stayed there. They put down roots, raised children, became Californians, but they never forgot where they came from. The songs they sang, the food they cooked, the stories they told their grandchildren, all of it carried echoes of the plains they had left behind. Their descendants still live there today. The great-grandchildren of Dust Bowl refugees, working in offices and factories and schools, most of them never knowing that their families once made that desperate journey down Route 66, carrying everything they owned toward an uncertain future. And the families who stayed, they rebuilt, slowly, painfully, but steadily. They used the new farming techniques. They planted the windbreaks. They treated the land with a respect that their parents and grandparents had never learned. The Dust Bowl taught them something that would be passed down through generations. The land will provide, but only if you take care of it. Only if you remember that you are not its master, but its steward. World War II came, and the young men of the plains went off to fight another kind of battle. When they returned, they found a land transformed. Green again, productive again, alive again. But they also found something else. A memory, collective and powerful, of what happens when humans push nature too far. The Dust Bowl ended more than 80 years ago. Most of the people who lived through it are gone now. The last survivors, interviewed by Ken Burns for his documentary in 2012, were in their 80s and 90s, recalling events from their childhoods with a clarity that time had not dimmed. They remembered the black blizzards. They remembered the taste of dust. They remembered brothers and sisters who didn't survive. They remembered everything. One survivor, asked to describe what those years were like, gave an answer that has become famous. "I don't care who describes that to you. Nobody can tell it any worse than what it was. And no one exaggerates that. There is no way for it to be exaggerated. It was that bad." What did the Dust Bowl teach America? It taught us that the land has limits, that you cannot take and take and take without consequence, that the earth will tolerate abuse for a while, but eventually it will fight back. It taught us that conservation matters. The Soil Conservation Service, created in the depths of the crisis, still exists today as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The techniques developed in the 1930s, contour ploughing, cover crops, windbreaks, are still used on farms across the country. Every time a farmer plants a row of trees or rotates crops to protect the soil, they are honoring lessons learned in the dust. It taught us that government can help. The New Deal programs that saved so many farm families established a principle that endures to this day. When disaster strikes, Americans help each other. Through their government, through their communities, through the simple recognition that we're all in this together. It taught us about resilience, about the human capacity to endure what seems unendurable, about getting up every morning and trying again, even when hope seems foolish. The people of the Dust Bowl didn't just survive. They rebuilt, they adapted, they found ways to thrive in a land that had tried to destroy them, and it gave us stories. Woody Guthrie wrote songs about the dust storms that still echo today. "So long, it's been good to know you." Dust Bowl Refugee, Talking Dust Bowl Blues. Music born from suffering, carrying the voices of the dispossessed into generations that would never know that world firsthand. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, telling the story of the Joad family's journey from Oklahoma to California. It won the Pulitzer Prize and helped Americans understand what their fellow citizens were going through. Decades later, it remains one of the great American novels, a testament to the power of storytelling to create empathy across time and distance. Dorothea Lange took photographs that burned themselves into the American consciousness. Her image of Florence Owens Thompson, known as Migrant Mother, became one of the most recognized photographs in history, a face that captured an entire era of hardship and determination. These artists gave voice to people who might otherwise have been forgotten. They made sure the world would remember. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Dust Bowl is the simplest one: memory itself. The people who lived through those years made sure their children knew what had happened, and those children told their children, and those children told theirs. The story has been passed down through 4 generations now, kept alive in family reunions and holiday dinners, in photo albums and oral histories. Because forgetting would be dangerous. The conditions that created the Dust Bowl haven't disappeared. The southern plains are still semi-arid, droughts still come. And in recent years, some of the old problems have started to return. Farmers, pressured by economics and competition, have begun removing shelter belts to squeeze a few more acres of cropland from their fields. The Ogallala Aquifer, the vast underground water source that transformed Great Plains agriculture, is being depleted faster than nature can replenish it. Scientists warn that another dust bowl is possible. Climate change is making droughts more frequent and more severe. Some models suggest that by the end of this century, the southern plains could experience conditions even worse than the 1930s. The question is whether we will remember the lessons our great-grandparents learned, whether we will respect the land's limits before nature forces us to, whether we will pass on not just the stories, but the wisdom they contain. Epilogue. What the Dust Remembers. There's a museum in Baca County, Colorado, in the heart of what was once the worst-hit region of the Dust Bowl. Among its exhibits is something remarkable. A jar of dust. Not just any dust. This is dust from the 1930s, collected from beneath the shingles of a house that survived those terrible years. When the roof was finally replaced decades later, the homeowner found a thick layer of fine, powdery dirt that had accumulated during the storms of his youth. He saved it. He donated it to the museum, and now visitors can see it, can touch it, can hold in their hands the actual substance that once buried farms and killed livestock and filled children's lungs with disease. The dust is surprisingly light, soft, almost silky. It's hard to imagine something so gentle causing so much destruction. Hard to believe that this powder once blotted out the sun. But it did. And somewhere in every handful of that dust are the stories of the people who endured it. The grandmother who crawled home on her hands and knees because she couldn't see through the storm. The little girl who died of dust pneumonia while her brother lay sick in the next room. The farmer who planted crops year after year in soil that wouldn't grow anything because hope was all he had left. The mother who held wet cloths over her baby's face, praying through the long, dark nights. The family that loaded everything they owned onto a broken-down car and drove toward California, not knowing what they would find. The ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who survived, the ones who didn't. All of their stories are in that dust. All of their struggles, all of their courage. The Dust Bowl was not just a weather event. It was not just an economic disaster. It was a crucible that tested everything Americans believed about themselves and their land. And somehow, through suffering and sacrifice and sheer stubborn determination, they came through it. They came through it changed, wiser, more humble, more aware of their place in the natural world. The question for us, their descendants and inheritors, is simple. Will we remember what they learned? Will we honor their sacrifice by protecting the land they saved? Will we be worthy of their legacy? The dust remembers. The land remembers. The only question is whether we will. In the early 1930s, the sky didn't storm. The ground did. And nothing in America was ever quite the same again. Dedicated to the survivors of the Dust Bowl, who endured the unimaginable and passed their stories down so we would never forget. And to their descendants, who carry those memories still.
Thanks for watching. I'm using this channel to learn English and learn about America history. Sorry for the voiceover, it's not the best because it's a free one. And subscribe to help us to reach 500 subscribers until the end of the year. I hope in 1 year my English will improve and I can use my own voice in the video. Thank you.